Right, the idea for this show came about when we were looking at the year ahead and we were thinking we need to showcase our collection and we need to do it in a way where it doesn't feel like we're rehashing things again. We're coming up with some new context for familiar faces in our collection. And so, in going through some of the strongest things in the collection, I realized that there were a whole lot of really fantastic landscape-inspired images and cityscape-inspired images. And so, I got the list down to maybe 50 things, and then from there, just kept paring it down because my hope was that we could do an installation where there might only be 20 or so things, and there's a lot of big things, a lot of space between works, so that each one had a chance to become a separate world for the viewer going through. One of the other things I didn't want to do is I didn't want it to feel like a hodgepodge, that we were just sort of putting things up wherever. And so what I've tried to do is come up with groupings of 3 or 4 things that have some connections in certain ways, whether it's technical, conceptual, subject matter. And so I'll try to explain why we've placed certain things where they're placed. Of course, with Charlotta Westergren's work, there was only one spot where it really would work. It was designed specifically for this width. It was supposed to go clean up to the very edges of the horizontal, and it's doing that. So this was the one spot where it would work. I guess since we're focused on that, I can mention that we had a show of her work, I think it was back in 2005, and it included a number of paintings as well as this site-specific work designed specifically for the gallery downstairs. Westergren's images tend to relate to her Scandinavian heritage, to fairy tales, to a relationship with the land that she recalls as a young girl before she moved to America with her family. And this was a large, ambitious piece that expresses her interest in working with different kinds of materials from time to time. And so she uses large sequins here and developed a composition where each one is pinned onto a panel of foam core, and up close it looks like some kind of a gridded conceptual work, totally abstract, and as you step back, just like with the pointillist painting, it all comes together and forms an image. In this case, it appears to be a large iceberg.
Just like the thread, it's a thread.
Exactly. And she's someone that hasn't studied the kinds of things that DeVore Sperber studied in terms of perception, the way the brain works, but Jim Campbell has. Campbell, in fact, was inspired by the same Scientific American article in 1973 by the Bell Lab scientist that produced that distorted image of Lincoln from the $5 bill. Jim Campbell read that same article and as a filmmaker and a computer engineer began to experiment with taking video imagery and sometimes creating stills, sometimes allowing the imagery to be still in motion, but he would reduce it down into individual pixels. Sometimes those pixels were in color, sometimes they're in black and white, and so he's playing with all these variables: color, light, resolution, movement versus still, increments of time, and trying to come up with ways to reflect the world around him. And so in this case, he's taken 192 LED lights, black and white footage, and we see this movement, which helps us recognize the fact that these appear to be individuals on a street. If this was just a still image, say right here, we wouldn't be able to recognize what it is, but the fact that you can gauge that rhythm movement of legs going back and forth or path of automobiles, we recognize that it's a city street. And this, in fact, is Manhattan, September 12th, 2001. So it's the day after 9/11. And Campbell, as much as he's focused on engineering and the science behind his art, he's also very much interested in the dimension of emotion, illusion. And so he was fascinated by the way in which the rhythms on the street in Manhattan were very different the day after that catastrophic event, 9/11. And the way in which people were walking around in sort of a stupor. And he just felt as if there was this larger change that was perceptible and that the camera could capture and that we could even pick up on, even when the imagery is reduced to this extent. We had a show of Campbell's work here, 2004, solo show of his work.
Yeah.
And this was a piece that was in the show. It's called Reconstruction 4, and was one of the smaller ones in the show. We acquired it either during or after the exhibition. And it's great. It's one of the 2 or 3 video pieces we have in the collection. So, looking at Jim Campbell and Charlotta Westergan, what you've got are 2 approaches to depicting the surrounding environment, where you're taking a complete scene and reducing it down into units of synthetic data. In this case, small LED light over here, sequin, but still conveying a feeling of the landscape. Here you've got this vast panorama. You feel like you're surrounded and lost in this thing. And scale is a very important issue for Westergan. Scale is also important to Campbell in terms of this being approximately the size of our average computer monitor, maybe black and white television in our kitchen. So again, scale is certainly something to keep in the conversation when you're in this part of the exhibition. In a similar way, not quite as synthetically, you've got Hawaiian artist Alison Moritsugu painting on sections of salvaged trees where she didn't cut these down, but they were either cut down by someone else and she salvaged them and cut them down into sections that she could then paint on, and then she would mount them on the wall. That became a different kind of approach to American landscape painting. She's very interested in that landscape tradition that this country has, going way back to the Hudson River School of Painters and before, and the way in which, for American painters of the 19th century, images of the landscape became very much loaded with political elements, with propaganda. It was about really sort of laying out this rationale of why we needed to move westward and lay claim to this land, that there was a destiny involved here. And Moritsugu calls that tradition and that perception into question. She also is very ecologically minded, and this method of working underscores her feeling that this infinite wilderness that you see implied in Hudson River School paintings really is an illusion, that in fact it's all disappearing with an alarming speed. And she also shows that our understanding of nature is fragmented, that we don't see the full picture. There's a lot that's missing, and that it's fading away. There's a sculptural presence to this I think is really interesting. It's almost as if you're looking down at a clear-cut forest from an overhead angle, seeing into the trunks of the trees. We all look at sections of old trees and look at the rings and think about the stories and maybe the way the environment looked when those trees were at this ring or at that ring. And here she sort of puts us in that same position. But the painting is very much in line with Hudson River School painting, where she's really making an attempt to paint things with blended colors that come as close to what your eye might see in nature, painting every leaf, going for the texture of rocks, looking at the different cloud and weather conditions, and trying to capture and describe nature in a pretty faithful way. And it's just this interrupted presentation that destroys the illusion of the grand panorama. We're aware of these isolated bits that the landscape's been reduced to. And some people have commented on the fact that the profile of this resembles a footprint. I don't know if that's intentional. I do have Allison's email address. Any of you that would like to follow up with her or any of the other artists, I'd be glad to let you ask questions. If there are some that people in the audience keep asking again and again, you can certainly email them and find out and let us know what you find.
Guinea pig. It's a guinea pig.
And I do want to point out, too, as with nearly every work of art, it's not going to last forever. Particularly artists who are using non-traditional materials, each work of art has a lifespan. I want to point out, because this is something important for tours and for the protection of his work. Some of these sections are starting to crack, or existing cracks when we bought the work are getting deeper. And so there are at least 3 or 4 of these sections where the cracks are becoming pretty significant, and others where the bark is separating from the inner core of the tree. Again, just things to be aware of, but and actually you'll see some open spots right here in some of these. That's because the center of the trunk usually is the first to begin to break down. And so, again, it's just got a finite lifespan. It looks like right here we may have lost some bark, either from handling, or it may have been like that before we got it. We have to go back and check the camera, but here's a really serious crack there. Just be aware that a lot of that's new, or fairly recent. Every time the humidity in here changes dramatically, which it shouldn't, but it does sometimes, that wood will expand and contract and intensify the problem. Still, I'm glad we acquired this. Yes, Carol.
What is the humidity temperature, or what are we talking about as far as temperature and humidity?
Well, in an ideal world, museums strike a nice balance between making people comfortable and making art comfortable. If we were just catering to the art, we'd all have parkas on. Art likes it, cold and dark. Humidity usually around 50% for most media. But we keep things ideally between 68 and 72 degrees Fahrenheit, between 45 and 55% humidity. And for the most part, our building does a good job. But there are times when we have events and doors are open, and there's a dramatic weather change, and our system doesn't respond quickly, and we'll have a humidity drop or a temperature spike, and our system eventually corrects itself. For a while, that sudden change puts a lot of stress on works of art.
Thank you.
Do you have any idea if she had, when she made this, she probably did have full knowledge that it would eventually deteriorate? And did she make that, do you think, with that in mind? Or, I know you can't read her mind.
Yeah, knowing Allison's awareness of nature and ecosystems, she was obviously aware that it had a lifespan that might be more limited than if she was using, say, oil on canvas or marble or whatever. But I don't think that she did anything to intensify that. Like, for instance, use wood that has especially delicate structure. I think she was just working with what she had at her disposal in the way that she likes to work. Some of the pieces she's done are on gigantic tree trunks that actually sit on the gallery floor and have a broad area that she paints on, where you have just basically one of these compositions but in a really large scale. You might have foreground, the sky, all in one big section of wood.
Do you know what kind of tree that is?
I don't. One of the things that you might do if any of you decide to email her is to find out, is this
we used to know.
tree that was indigenous to Hawaii, perhaps. I don't know.
I thought it was I thought there were a couple of different trees that we had in the original, when we first.
Well, I mean, the bark is different color on some of them, but I just didn't know if that was
the
younger.
grain is like from here to here. This looks more like birch. This looks like it might be, I don't know, acacia. I'm not sure. But again, that information may be somewhere in the files.
Yeah, I think I'll go back and see what I can find it.
This work by Stefan Curtin we wanted to bring into the mix. We've shown it in other collection shows, but we like the idea that with a show like this, it gives you a chance to maybe rediscover works that you thought you knew all about, or see them in a different context. And this is one of the few in the show that shows a suburban scene. And Curtin is someone that is interested in the notion of home, in the notion of sort of making it to the point where in your life you're comfortable, you have what you need, and you feel like you've arrived. He's often looking at magazine images which present very glamorous views of suburban life in very desirable neighborhoods. Maybe they're advertising a type of patio chair or who knows what, but he'll take those magazine images, and sometimes they're photographs that he's taken himself, and he'll reduce them down to fairly simplified, almost a drawing of paint. He'll take sort of dark brown paint, lay down the texture and basic contours of what he sees, and then he'll go back in and add broad areas of color where it's not really, like for instance, if you look at the color of this pool water, it's pretty much the same color turquoise. The top of this shade is pretty much the same color blue. He's not doing a whole lot of modulating of color. And what you'll notice too is there's something really strange about this whole scene. It's painted against an underlying layer of metallic spray paint. And the subtle message here is sort of feeling that maybe what we're going after is an artificial dream. There's something that's not really fully real about it. Maybe when we get there, it won't taste as sweet, or it won't feel like home. There's an emptiness, an isolation here, and a shallowness that is sort of implied in the way he's handling the materials. So without having to put up a billboard saying what this is all about, he uses his paint, he uses his colors, his textures in a way that reinforces that subtle message. And he's intrigued with these places, he's intrigued with these ideals, but at the same time he wants to hold up the fact that there are these underlying issues of superficiality and artificiality that contemporary life needs to be more aware of, and remind itself of maybe what the values associated with home really need to be. I want to put them together here because if you're coming into a show with pieces like the Westergan and the Campbell that maybe are a little bit outside your normal understanding of landscape imagery, we thought this might be a safe and comfortable point of entry. And these appear to be specific, descriptive images of the land where if you got in a car and you drove out there where Chuck Forsman normally painted, you might be able to find this spot. Or if you went out to the slopes with Natasha Kissel in wintertime, you could find this specific vantage point from which she painted this work. Well, that's not true. Both artists share an interest in creating very elaborate, very detailed images of the landscape, but they create their works based on multiple views, multiple photographs from different locations. And they stitch these together to produce a whole new reality. Now, you might be able to find the dam that Forsman based this on, or maybe this hillside. But again, he's taken so many liberties with the original images that it would be really difficult to do that. This work is called Park. It's one our collectors group acquired several years ago. And the title makes you wonder what he's referring to. He's often in his work looking at the intersection between civilization and nature and the effects of that intersection, the scars left on the land. In some cases, the places he's portraying are national parks, but showing scars, showing development. He's not necessarily painting it out as something ugly, but he's just sort of showing it for what it is. And then you've got this car that's parked in this gigantic lot, and this small wedge of park that's been spared from development. So when you see that word park as the title, you're not sure exactly which of these he's referring to, probably to all of them. And you'll notice the frame is designed by the artist. He wants to break out of that rectangular boundary. He really wants to use curves and angles to give us almost a feeling that we're standing on a precipice and we might fall off in one direction or the other. So that's something that really affects our viewing of this in an interesting way.
Somebody, many years ago, when they looked at this, I think it was somebody from TVA, who said that really isn't a parking lot, it's really a spillway for the dam. So hence that adds another mystery of just what is this car doing in the spillway.
Right. No, I think the spillway thing makes a lot more sense.
For the dam.
And it looks like trucks here coming back and forth, who knows what they're doing, but that car is certainly parked in a pretty precarious spot too.
Yeah.
If it were my car, I'd be right here.
It's so exciting to see an artist make his frame as as important as his picture, or that it complements each other rather than just a wooden frame. That is so exciting to me. It brings real aliveness to the whole picture.
Well, something people have commented on too is the arc of this may be playing off of the idea that you're experiencing the landscape through the windshield of the car, which is frustrating to me because we have two paintings over there by Tom McGrath that I wanted to have right here, but they just wouldn't fit the way we wanted to, so they had to move over there. They've got great links to the pieces on that wall, but it would have been nice to have them here.
The kids often refer to the trees as Lego trees. I mean, that's something that they always come up with when they look at this, which makes it an even more kind of an artificial.
I think they're Leonardo trees. If you look at the Adoration of the Magi or other Leonardo da Vinci paintings, you'll see that it's terraced trees and the ones that have this sort of spear point shape. At least that's what I thought of when I saw them. But the main point is that they are conventional. They've been conventionalized. They're based on the real thing, but they've been broken down into more geometric shapes.
It really is very cool.
Oh, the other thing you can do too is you can point out, ask kids or tour groups if this looks like it's photographic at all, and you can let them know that he based it on photographs, but also point out that look at how abstract all of this is here. It's all very smudgy, and if you get close to this, it begins to break down into just pure brushwork. Natasha Kissel is, I think her father is an architect, but all I know is that she has grown up around modernist architecture and adores it and includes it in nearly all of her paintings. Her typical formula is you'll see some spectacular piece of modernist architecture in the foreground, and then in the background there'll be equally spectacular peaks or a spread of the valley. And so you've got spectacular civilization, spectacular nature that are together, but an unhappy mix. They never quite mesh. The lines of recession on the architecture and the lines of recession in the landscape usually are divergent. And so there's this feeling that she has forced them together in an uneasy union. And that's in fact what she's done. She's taken photographs from different locations and come back into the studio and has constructed something that's largely invented. Here the architecture is a little more nestled into the landscape. Now, this is a little bit atypical based on the other things that you'll see if you do some research on her. It feels like these chalets are really tucked into the landscape instead of just sort of plopped down in the foreground. But one thing you'll notice is, as you get back into just the very immediate foreground, notice how the buildings here and the buildings that are really pretty far back, the scale really isn't that different. And if you look at how much recession you have here, these ought to be much larger, these ought to be much smaller. You've got these vignettes of a car sort of driving through the middle of a snowy field, and I just think that in the condition that you got right there, that car probably isn't going very far. And you got the wolves right here just sort of plunked down the middle, just a few feet away from where people are hanging out. And just, again, it's this strange juxtaposition of nature, culture, built environment, and natural beauty. She often uses very saturated colors too. Pinks and purples and blues are pretty typical of her. And almost always these sort of vast environments where you see way into the distance. That's typical for Natasha. And she's in London. Let's see. This is a little bit of serendipity. I wasn't sure that we'd be able to include this work in the show. I really wanted to. I thought it would be a great lead-in because it's an image that's bold and really draws you in from a distance. And it's one that was photographed here in town, probably somewhere off the Chapman Highway. I'd love to have someone do some research and see if they can help us pin down exactly where David Hilliard was when he photographed this 9 years ago, 2001.
I
But
think
it also-
Lisa Carroll knows.
Lisa Carroll?
And I can't remember, because she told me that it was taken somewhere, and I can't remember, so.
Excellent. Okay, well maybe that can become passed around knowledge for all of you when you're giving your tours, because some people really want to know that. But what's interesting is that you've got these multiple frames instead of just a single panoramic image. And the way these are stitched together makes me think of what some of the other artists doing, but we're translating it into paint. And that is, again, fragmenting a scene, making changes to it in terms of your distance from the subject. Here, Hilliard is zooming in much closer to the kudzu in the foreground, allowing there to be blurriness here or there, pulling away. So you get the sense that the artist, from frame to frame, has slightly shifted the angle from the subject or the distance. And he's interested in experimenting with those changes in position and the effect they have on the emotional content of the scene. And I think it also, in this left to right format, makes you think of frames in a film. It almost implies a sense of movement in a different way. You've got movement in terms of distance as well as in sort of multiple frames moving from left to right. And there's also an implied storyline, but none exists. These are usually scenes that he takes that appear to be snapshots, but they're usually carefully staged, and they're almost always in small, rural, southern communities. This is one of several works in the show that may challenge some people's perceptions of what a landscape or a cityscape ought to be, what qualifies as that kind of subject. And this is one I was really excited to discover when I was talking to the daughter of Buck Ewing, Hillary Combs. She allowed me to come take a look at her father's and mother's collection and select some things that she would donate to the museum. And I came across this, and I loved it right away, and I liked it even more when I realized who painted it. Robert Vandeventer. I actually knew Bob when he was in his late 80s, early 90s. He lived over here in Fort Sanders, not too far from the hospital, and he was an astute collector of art. He also worked at least one museum around town, and I saw a couple of landscape paintings of his that are in the McClung collection that are much more straightforward Appalachian landscape scenes. And Bob was somebody that always talked about other artists' work. He never told me about his own work. I found out about it after he died. And so when I saw his signature on this, I realized here was Bob really venturing outside of his normal territory. There are very few of his paintings that I've ever seen. I think I've seen maybe 3 or 4, period. They're all excellent. But this is the only one that I've seen that ventures into this more adventurous, abstract realm where he's using bright, really intense color. He's avoiding any kind of depth of field. It's all on the surface with different kinds of mark making, looking at these angular formations that together make me think of a city scene at night where there's either a festival, it could be a fire, something really dynamic is going on when I look at this. And some of the mark making suggests figures as well as structures. And so I think it's a great addition to the show as a metaphysical landscape or urban scene, something that he's remembering, something he's constructing in his mind. It's very much about paint on the surface, but I think at the root of his inspiration, there is something that he saw somewhere, some cityscape somewhere that really was behind a lot of this. It makes me think sometimes, too, of Picasso's Guernica. It's something about the shapes and the angular lines. It feels like it's lit from within, sort of a phosphorescence to the greens and yellows that makes you think of artificial lighting. The blues, predominantly along that top edge, again suggest a night scene. You can see what appear to be roof lines, maybe. I don't know, but I thought it would be really nice work to have and a conversation we have in this gallery.
Did he know Robert Kirkwood?
I was
mean,
gonna
did
say,
they
it
know
reminds me.
that there's a,
Similarity.
We need to ask Bob Burgo that. I don't know. I don't know to what degree he was involved in that circle. I don't have any evidence of it, but you're right. There certainly is a similarity in terms of the power.
A connection to higher ground.
yes.
Well, there are many.
Landscape.
There are many.
There's many in here.
Yeah.
I more or less intended for these three and the two back there to be part of a loose grouping along the lines of a primal landscape or an elemental scene, something that's broken down to a pretty basic language where it's not about describing a specific spot, sometimes with not even much of any illusion of space. And so that's to me how a lot of these are united. This is by Darren Waterston, an artist from California who has spent an entire career working with landscape imagery, very much inspired by Asian landscape painting traditions, Asian calligraphy, as well as by Albrecht Altdorfer and other European landscape masters, especially with landscapes in which there is some kind of a spiritual content. There's something going on that really reinforces the idea that in nature it's not trees, people, mountains, it's all flowing together. There are these forces that make it all one entity. And so in his work, you really have a hard time separating what is atmosphere, what is terrain, what is maybe flora or fauna. It all sort of bleeds together. Time is sometimes stopped or sometimes accelerated. A lot of his things look as if they've been aged or exposed to different elements. This comes from a fairly recent series he did that has an apocalyptic theme to it, where there would be 4 or 5 different scenes that represent stages moving toward the end of time. And this one's called Ice and Stars. And you've got these beautiful smudges, almost a Milky Way running through the middle of this, these streaks of what appear to be frost on the window, and then also strange marks that make it look as if maybe a tree or some of these ice formations are almost in a pixelated form. They're very mechanical. The rectangular profile of these marks is really different from how subtle some of these atmospheric effects are up here. He's painting with highly blended color, very small brushes, lots and lots of layers. With this, he's rubbing through it, creating smudges where it looks like maybe there's a tree here that's become eroded or has begun to sort of disintegrate, or maybe it's forming, we're not sure. It's a world in flux, and there are times too when you'll see these pools of liquid paint that almost look like portals into another world, or they look like you're looking through a microscope into some tiny world that's too small for us to see with the naked eye. Over here is a work by Tomery Dodge. And I believe we had a show of Tomery's work several years ago too. And this is one of the larger pieces that was in the show. It's called Mirage. And it's one that I think is really pretty exciting. He's somebody that loves to depict the landscape in a way that has an energy to it, trauma, something climactic is happening. There is an ice flow that's about to rupture, or something's about to change in any of his landscapes. And this is one where he wanted to capture this feeling of searing heat on an open plain. It does have the feeling that you're looking across a body of water too, but it's really meant to be that feeling of heat that's to the point at which the solid landscape begins to, at least for our eyes, dissolve. And what is actually an opaque, rough terrain looks like something reflective and maybe shimmering. Something else that he likes to do is use pigment in a way where no matter how lost we get in this world, he calls our attention back to the surface. He's building up paint, dragging it, scraping it on, brushing it on, and so we're aware of his every movement. One of the things that he thought was really exciting about this particular work is the opportunity to use colors that we normally associate as being artificially pure, something you might see in a billboard or something in the sky like in a rainbow, but you wouldn't really associate colors this pure with the natural landscape. But because it's a mirage, he's able to use these colors to create that effect of searing heat and of this illusion that takes place. So he's using something artificial in a way that actually is natural. At least to our eye, it's convincing that way. But this is one that works so well up close. If you get back from it, it tightens up and works well from a distance. Here are two paintings that we've acquired fairly recently. This one has never been shown. This one I don't think has been shown either. It was another piece that was given to us by Buck Ewing's daughter. I came across it in lots of things that she had at her home, and I recognized right away who it was. It's unusual for him, but it's by Herbert Creasy, he was a well-known abstract artist based in Atlanta. Sam Yates at Ewing Gallery has done several shows of Herb's work over the years. Matter of fact, I met Herb when I was a student in art years ago, and so when I found this piece, I thought it'd be great to have something of his in our collection. This is a piece from probably the mid-1960s. He's probably created this whole thing laying down on the tabletop, pouring plaster into some kind of a form, and then embedding objects into that plaster as it's drying, pulling them out, maybe laying down more plaster, applying pigment. And so really what he's done is he has created a work of art that echoes a natural rock formation, sedimentary layers. He's created something that's almost like a landscape, but simply tilted down so that we're looking at it from a different angle, from above. If you were an ant that was dropped down on the surface of this, you would very much feel like you're out in the natural world. I think he's an artist that always had a sense of humor. I think he may have intended this lighter area to be a lowercase first initial, the letter H. And some people have looked at it and said, it looks like almost like an abstracted house. But whatever it is, we included it in this show because of the sort of rugged surface where the landscape references aren't pictorial, they're sculptural. Same with this work by Roger Wyke, an artist from California who's given us another work several years earlier. And his earlier work was made with just all kinds of materials that were thrown onto the floor and embedded in this matrix, this rubber-like matrix that he would then peel up and put on the wall. This one's very different. It's on canvas, and he would lay the canvas flat and apply to it marble dust, asphalt, other kinds of pigment, and he allowed them to cure and to coagulate over a length of time. So again, it's almost like this landscape has been allowed to form where he's looking at textures and layers and a buildup of pigment in a way that isn't representing anything beyond the surface. He wants it all to be about the surface. And he wants to create work in ways where you're not sure if this is done by human hands or by natural forces. He likes that ambiguity. As I mentioned, one of the things we're doing a little differently with this show, yes, nearly everything in here is from our collection, but we included 4 works that are going to be featured in our June 1st purchase reception event that our Collector Circle has each year, where they help us acquire something for the collection. And I'll talk about each one of these for a few minutes and then let them vote on which one they want to purchase for us using their funds. And this is one that is by Richard Galpin, a young British artist, who goes out into usually very chaotic cityscapes that are dense with billboards and lots of buildings packed in together, people everywhere, and he will take photographs of them, large format color photographs, and then he'll go back to the studio and he will meticulously use a scalpel and peel away that color emulsion that's on the surface, leaving just the bare photographic paper. Matter of fact, you can see places where he's allowed those tears and rips to show. He doesn't want to hide what he's doing. And in some cases, he's following the lines of perspective that were actually in the photograph. In other cases, he's changing things entirely to create a different kind of space, to produce a network of geometric shapes that suggests a strange utopian future, or look like some conceptual diagram for a computer circuit or something. But this one is in fact based on an image he took in Times Square in New York. And I'm hoping that when you give tours, you'll allow your tour groups to look at this for a while and really wrestle with it before you point out what logo that is up there in the sky, because that sort of brings it back down to early 21st century America. Do you know what logo that is?
Starbucks.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah. So. But for those that feel as if this is some alien world, that'll help them connect with what he's doing. This is a painting by a German artist named Ulf Puder. It's called Baustock. And Puder is a member of the so-called Leipzig School, a group of artists who are now sort of mid-career, who have attracted international attention for their typically architectural scenes. Neo Rausch will include a lot of figures and text, but Puder is someone that has more hard-edged minimal approach, where he'll usually depict cities, towns, suburbs that are reduced to being fairly generic. We're not sure if they're based on real places or whether they come out of the depths of his imagination. But what's characteristic about Puder's scenes is that they tend to be isolated, deserted, out of balance. There appears to be some cataclysmic event that happened here shortly before we see it. You get the feeling that maybe there was an explosion or maybe an earthquake, because everything is a little out of kilter. The roof lines appear to go in different directions. Things don't connect. This crossbeam never really touches this upright. The bridge that we have to pass to get into or out of the town, there's a whole section of it missing. Something else that's remarkable about his work is the fact that he uses a mechanical straight edge for every contour, nearly every contour of the painting. So there's a mechanical, hard-edge control quality to it. At the same time, the way he's laying down the paint, he's allowing for smudges and drips and texture. He's allowing earlier marks to shine through, where at one point this dwelling was actually out to here. He's making editorial changes in a way that he's going to allow us to see and be part of. There are a number of different places where he's made corrections. This connecting line at one point was out here. He's very much interested in shadows, so there's a great sense of depth, even though we're pulled back to the surface by all the paint texture. And there's something about his canvas that always made me think of a theater stage. Everything feels like a prop. It's as if these houses aren't really construction grade. They're just sort of props that might fall over at any moment.
Was he an extra small XS?
He was. He was, yes. He had the piece that was just in the doorway to your left. I think it was some sort of a satellite dish painting.
Okay. Is this one of the purchase reception ones?
It is,
Okay.
yes. The other two are further down. I think rather than jump around, what I'll do is just continue here, and I'll point out which ones are purchase reception when we get there. These are the two paintings I was speaking of earlier by Tom McGrath that I thought would be a great fit over there with the Natasha Kissel and the Chuck Forsman. I saw McGrath's work in a show at the UN Gallery that was highlighting artists and residents from the past who had been at UT for a while. And Sam Yates organized a biennial. We brought back several of them to show together. And Giles Lyon is one. We'll look at his work in a minute. Tom McGrath was another one. And Tom had a series of landscapes that were about this size and a couple of really large cityscapes. And I thought these were a great fit. One of the reasons why is I think they're beautiful paintings, but I was intrigued by his method, his approach. These are landscapes that are stitched together from a number of views of the land that he received through car rides. He would drive through the East Tennessee landscape and would either remember certain scenes at night or he'd take photographs through the windshield, and so you have a landscape experienced in this artificial way. So many of us see the world now through the windshield of our car. We wish we could sort of stop and get out and have a picnic, but a lot of times our experience with nature is through the windshield of the car in motion. And so he's trying to capture that feeling. He's giving us that distinct language of a landscape, but look at all the things he's doing on the surface. He's allowing the bare primer to show through, where there's almost nothing but just white space. Just a ghostly silhouette of trees, perhaps, again, one of his nighttime drives where the headlights hit the trees and all you got was a silhouette against the dark background. Some areas are blurry, as if, again, when you look out to the side, you see the landscape going by so quickly that you can't really lock onto it. So there's a feeling of motion. He's also building up the paint in a way that's really physical and textural. And you get the feeling that he's almost playing around with swatches of color that are based on memories he's had of the landscape, where, hey, I'm going to remember my palette, what I saw when I drove through there. I'm going to remember some of the outlines and contours. I'm going to remember maybe some of the interior portions of the car I was in. It's all fragmented and brought back together and synthesized in this really artificial way. Same with this one. The same kind of silhouettes as if you're looking up through the branches into the night sky with the leaves and the branches silhouetted or highlighted by the lights. Very sort of liquid environment here where he's dumping thinned out paint over much thicker paint to create veils and give this kind of distancing effect. And you'll see some hard-edged images that again make you think maybe you're looking through the window, maybe that's an edge of the door, but it's all muted enough and fragmented enough that we're not able to lock on to anything definite. But I like the fact that this is a landscape-inspired image that was done by an artist who is in motion. And David Hilliard moved around from point to point, from frame to frame. Tom McGrath remembers this all from being in motion, and much of it at night. Zsolt Bodoni is a young Hungarian artist and is one of a generation of really talented painters coming out of Eastern Europe who are producing heroic, scaled, epic images that are narrative. Many of them are politically charged, and they examine the recent political past of their countries, but also looking back even further into the pre-communist past of their countries. And in this one, Bodoni is focused on the theme of foundries, these large production centers where political sculpture is cast, large-scale equestrian statues, monuments of national heroes, and almost all of his scenes are laid down with this bold brushwork. It looks like it may have been wiped on with a gigantic brush or with wads of cloth. Again, bold, broad strokes, done with a sense of urgency. You almost get the feeling that he had to get this done before someone found out. He didn't have the time to labor over every square inch of canvas. And in this series, he's looking back to what happened when the communists came into power, and many earlier sculptures documenting Hungary's long past were destroyed and melted down. Heroes from the Renaissance, heroes from other walks of life, all those sculptures that didn't fall in line with the communist ideology were destroyed. images of Stalin or whomever, Tito, the other leaders, were created and erected in their place. Then when communism went away, there was this feeling of a void that had to be filled. What do we do now? We've lost touch with a lot of our leaders and the presence of those leaders visibly within our urban centers. And so this series goes back to this effort after the fall of communism to reclaim that earlier past, to rebuild those civic monuments, and to raise questions about how much does the quality of life really change from regime to regime or from era to era, from one type of government to another. And so we see a row of horse sculptures going back into the distance, shadows of either this figure against the back wall, or maybe there's another horse hanging here. But again, just beautifully laid down, bold areas of color. The crucible where the molten metal would have been kept, molds were probably back in here somewhere. So we're looking into this massive warehouse where sculptures were produced. In other images, they might be sculptures that are being liquidated. Some of his scenes, you'll see an image of Lenin or Stalin that's been raised up by ropes and is being carted away for destruction.
No.
It's okay. If you have questions, now's the time.
And somehow it seemed to be the mirage and the apocalypse both coming into this.
Well, that's one of the things I'm hoping will happen, is that while we've tried to set up certain sub-themes, there are lots of great relationships that happen throughout this gallery. And to tell you the truth, I'd love to think we could keep the show up for a long time. I mean, if we had enough space, it would be great to have a permanent contemporary gallery like we have with Higher Ground that can just focus on themes like this. So we'll get there at some point, but I'm glad you're picking up on those relationships, and that's something that I'm hoping that your tour groups will want to hear about as well. You might ask them if there are any connections that they've seen that go from one side of the gallery to the other. Another work that may challenge your audiences to understand why it's included is this work by Jared Sprecher, because at first glance, it doesn't seem to be a landscape, it doesn't seem to be a cityscape, so why is it in this show? And what I try to do is include at least a handful of things where maybe it's questionable as to why it's here, but in talking with Jared about his work, and talking to Jared about this particular painting, A Type of Magic is what it's called, he really is inspired by the surrounding environment. Looking at imagery he encounters walking through the halls of the Art and Architecture Building daily, or at home looking at plans or drawings, looking through magazines, art history books. And in this case, there are several references to pictorial space. The purple lines that you see right here form this network are based on architectural drawings of urban spaces. The two arrows that we see that have been taped off, painted over, and then the tape has been peeled away to reveal the underlying yellow. Those were arrows that he saw taped to columns inside the building that he works, in the studio there. So he's looking very much like Tom McGrath is at the world around him, and these sort of snapshot mental images, and bringing those into a composition that is really very much involved with abstract space, where he's implying lines of recession, where he's making us feel as if there's some space there, but we can't really figure out how to enter it, or if we get in there, how we get back out again. In some cases, he's looking at landscape paintings from art history, the work of Albrecht Dürer, a print of his called Melancholia, where you've got this geometric shape that was one of the first anchor images laid down before he built up layers of spray paint and other imagery. You know, in the use of spray paint, you can refer this back to Stefan Curtin's work, but a very different use of spray paint. Here it becomes this active line, almost like he's vandalizing his own work. He's spray painted right across the center of it, but then it's gone back in with other layers as well. And the thing with Jerry's work that I always find really exciting is looking at how many different ways he's laying down paint, all the different effects that he's using. It's almost calling your attention more than anything to just all the possibilities for painting and different effects one can create. Whether it's squeegeeing on a broad area of pale turquoise, or again, taping off areas. He's allowed graphite to remain on the surface. He's spray painting. He's masking off. He's just coming up with all kinds of different ways of laying down broad, thick paint, narrow, thick paint, leaving rough edges on the paint, and in other cases, making it look as if it's mechanically produced. A lot of stenciling going on too with some of these areas of color. I'll give you the background on why anybody would paint a painting this large or maybe the way it looks. It has a lot to do with its individual history. Back in, I want to say it was 1997, Giles Lyon, who's up in New York now, was offered an exhibition by a major gallery, Deitch Projects. And Giles was excited. He went to Deitch and looked at their space and wanted to sort of figure out, okay, like a lot of artists, he's driven to make work by deadlines and by the show space that he has an opportunity to work in. So he was aware of how big Deitch's project space was, and he said, this is the perfect opportunity for me to work on a whole new scale. I've always wanted to do a large scale. Now is the time to do it. So he begins a couple of colossal canvases. This is one of them. And they begin as drop cloths on the floor in the studio, where he's working on other things that he's trying to finish off, but any kind of incidental footprints or paint spills served as points of reference for something for him to react to later on. And so this started as a drop cloth. Well, what happens? About a month or two before the show, Deitch pulls the plugs, pulls the rug out from under him. The show is canceled. Some of Giles' artist friends, who were represented by Deitch, leave the gallery in protest because of it. And so Giles is thinking, what do I do now? So he ends up, about a year or two later, finishing off the other one, and it goes to a museum. This one he continues to hold on to, and he works on it for 12 years. He doesn't finish it until last year when Sam Yates was telling him about this biennial show, and so Giles is thinking, I better finish this thing off. So it becomes a diary. It becomes this, I'm trying to think of it, like a backstop for all of his other work. Different series, different things going on in his life. As he's producing and sending out smaller works, he's maybe trying out new ideas in this, and constantly adding to it and working it. Eventually it goes from the floor up onto stretcher bars and up on the wall. He's probably standing on ladders and getting up into every corner of it. And he's very much inspired by all kinds of scientific, political themes of the day. He reminds me of William Wiley, whose work we've shown in our collection. He's this voracious reader. He's taking in CNN reports on findings overseas in some bunker where nuclear waste is kept. He's keeping up with new experiments with mushroom spores. He's looking at all these things, and they're bouncing around in his head. He's very much interested in the way that mushrooms colonize and the way that our cities and our urban development mirrors those same patterns. So if you look at this, he's very much trying to create that feeling that we are looking down at a world that is spawning out of control.